The credit card statement trembled in my hand, my vision blurring as I stared at the hotel charge for the 11th consecutive month. The Riverside Inn, 30 miles away from our suburban home, always on a Tuesday night. Tonight would be Tuesday again. The neatly printed evidence of my husband's betrayal burned into my retinas as I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself against the granite kitchen counter that suddenly felt like the only solid thing in my world. Breathing helps, I whispered to myself, an absurd bit of self-coaching that almost made me laugh despite the hole being torn through my chest. 20 years of marriage to Charles, 20 years of trust, of building a life together, raising 2 children, and now this. Not just an affair, no. Something more calculated, more systematic. I'm Elaine Winters, 52 years old, meticulous accountant and, as it turns out, the most gullible woman in Connecticut. My phone chimed with a text from Charles, meeting running late. Don't wait up. The familiar message that had once inspired nothing more than mild disappointment now twisted my stomach into knots. How many times had I received this exact text over the past year? How many late meetings had actually been nights spent in someone else's arms? I poured myself a glass of Merlot, Charles's favorite, ironically, and carried the credit card statements to our home office. Opening my laptop, I began to dig deeper, methodically combing through our financial records like I would for a suspicious client audit. My accounting background finally serving a purpose beyond tax season. 4 hours and 2 glasses of wine later, I had constructed a timeline that made me physically ill. The hotel visits began 15 months ago, always on Tuesdays. Alongside them, I discovered cash withdrawals of $500 every 2 weeks, a separate cell phone plan I'd never noticed, and, most damning of all, property tax payments on an address I didn't recognize. My husband owned property I knew nothing about. I sat back in my chair, staring at the spreadsheet I'd created. The evidence was overwhelming, but something felt different from the standard affair scenario. This wasn't impulsive. This was methodical, calculated, sustained. Charles wasn't just cheating, he was living another life. The grandfather clock in our hallway, a wedding gift from Charles's parents, chimed midnight. The sound echoed through our empty house, reminding me how alone I truly was. Our daughter Melissa was in graduate school in California, and our son Jason had moved to Chicago after college. Neither of them had any idea their father was dismantling the foundation of our family brick by careful brick. Sleep eluded me that night as I laid beside Charles, studying his familiar profile in the darkness. The gentle curve of his nose, the slight cleft in his chin, the gray at his temples that had only made him more handsome as he aged. When had my husband, the man who had held my hand through 20-hour labor with Melissa, who had sobbed with pride at Jason's college graduation, become a stranger capable of such calculated deception? I didn't confront him the next morning. Instead, I kissed him goodbye as he left for work, the casualness of the gesture requiring every ounce of my acting ability. "I love you," he said reflexively at the door, briefcase in hand. "Love you too," I replied, the words tasting like ash on my tongue. When his car disappeared down our tree-lined street, I sprang into action. I called my office, claiming a family emergency, not entirely a lie, and then reached out to a name in my contacts I'd never expected to need, Ryan Delgado, a private investigator who had helped my firm trace assets in a complicated divorce case last year. Ryan arrived at my house 2 hours later, his weathered face revealing nothing as I spread my evidence across our dining room table. "It's pretty clear he's leading a double life," Ryan said, examining my spreadsheet. "This level of organization, these regular patterns, this isn't just an affair, Mrs. Winters. Elaine, I corrected automatically, my hands clutching my coffee mug to stop their trembling. And I knew that already. What I need to know is who she is, where this property is located, and exactly what I'm dealing with. Ryan nodded, his expression softening slightly. I'll find out everything. But are you sure you want to know? Sometimes. I've been living a lie for God knows how long, I interrupted, my voice sharper than intended. I need the truth, Ryan. All of it. Fair enough, he conceded, gathering the papers. I'll start with the property address. That should tell us plenty. After Ryan left, I wandered through the house that had been my home for 15 years, seeing it with new eyes. The family photos on the wall, Charles beaming with his arm around me at our 20th anniversary party just last year. Had he been thinking of her even then? The antique desk he'd surprised me with for my 50th birthday, had he selected similar thoughtful gifts for his other, what? Girlfriend? Mistress? I stopped at our bedroom door, a sudden thought freezing me in place. What if it was worse than that? What if there was another wife? Another family? The possibility sent me rushing to the bathroom, where I vomited until my stomach ached and tears streamed down my face. I caught my reflection in the mirror, pale, eyes red-rimmed, hair disheveled. I barely recognized myself. Pull yourself together, I whispered to my reflection. You need to be smarter than him now. I showered, dressed in my most confidence-boosting outfit, a tailored navy pantsuit I reserved for important client meetings, and made a decision. I would not be a passive victim in this nightmare. I would investigate on my own, parallel to Ryan's professional efforts. My first step, follow Charles to his Tuesday night rendezvous. The next day passed in a fog of pretense. I went to work, reviewed tax documents, smiled at colleagues, and answered emails as if my world hadn't imploded. Charles texted me during lunch, "Hope your day is going well. I'll pick up dinner tonight." The casual domesticity of it made me want to scream. Instead, I texted back a cheerful reply complete with a heart emoji, the performance making me feel slightly nauseous. That evening, Charles arrived with Chinese takeout, my favorite, in a twisted show of consideration. We ate at the kitchen island, making small talk about his workday, about a call I'd received from Melissa, about the unseasonably warm October weather. "I'm sorry about tomorrow night," he said as we cleaned up, his voice so convincingly regretful I almost doubted my evidence. "This client presentation is crucial. We could lose the Peterson account if it goes poorly." "Don't worry about it," I replied, carefully rinsing a plate. "These things happen. Work is important." He approached from behind, wrapping his arms around my waist and pressing a kiss to my neck. I fought the instinct to stiffen, to pull away from this man who had become a stranger. "You're the best," he murmured against my skin. "So understanding. I don't deserve you." On that point, at least, we were in complete agreement. Tuesday arrived with the weight of inevitability. I dressed for work as usual, but packed a change of clothes in my car, dark jeans and a black sweater, nondescript for surveillance. I told my assistant I'd be leaving early for a doctor's appointment, setting my plan in motion. At 5:30, I parked across the street from Charles's office building, slouched in my seat with large sunglasses obscuring my face. At 6:15, his silver BMW emerged from the parking garage. My heart hammered in my chest as I pulled into traffic, maintaining a safe distance behind him. To my surprise, he didn't head straight for the Riverside Inn. Instead, he drove to an upscale residential area about 20 minutes from our home, a neighborhood of modern townhouses and small-lot single-family homes. I watched from down the block as he pulled into the driveway of a modest but well-maintained two-story house, removed something from his trunk, and walked to the front door. He didn't knock. He used a key. I sat frozen in my car, breath caught in my throat, as the door opened before Charles could even turn the key fully. A woman stood in the doorway, petite, with shoulder-length dark hair, wearing jeans and a simple blouse. She looked to be in her early 40s, attractive in an understated way. She smiled broadly at Charles, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. But what made my blood run cold wasn't the kiss. It was the small figure that appeared behind her, a boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, who launched himself at Charles with a cry of "Dad." Charles caught the boy, lifting him in a bear hug with practiced ease, his laughter carrying across the quiet street to where I sat, my world splintering into irreparable pieces. This wasn't just an affair. Charles had another family. I don't remember driving to the hotel where I'd booked a room, away from our house, where I couldn't bear to return. I don't remember checking in or riding the elevator. My next clear memory is sitting on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, Ryan Delgado's concerned voice coming through the speaker. "Elaine? Are you still there?" "He has a child," I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "A son." The boy called him Dad. Ryan's silence spoke volumes. "Finally, I was just about to call you. I've identified the property owner as Rebecca Tanner, 43. Elementary school teacher. The property was purchased 7 years ago, with Charles listed as co-owner under a slightly altered name, Charles Winston instead of Winters. Winston, I repeated numbly. His mother's maiden name. There's more, Ryan continued gently. County records show a birth certificate for Ethan Winston Tanner, age 9. Father listed as Charles Winston. 9 years. For 9 years, my husband had been living a double life, raising another child, loving another woman. The scope of the deception was staggering. How? I asked, the question directed as much to the universe as to Ryan. How could he maintain this for so long without me suspecting anything? Compartmentalization, Ryan answered. I've seen it before, though rarely this extensive. Some people can mentally separate their lives completely, different personas for different situations. It's not common, but when someone is motivated enough to create and sustain a second family, to father another child while still playing the devoted husband and father in his first life. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that it defied my ability to process it. What do you want to do next? Ryan asked. We have enough evidence for your lawyer, if you want to proceed with divorce. Divorce. The word hung in the air, simultaneously obvious and unthinkable. 20 years of marriage ending in this sordid, incomprehensible mess. Not yet, I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. I need to understand more. I need to know how deep this goes. After ending the call with Ryan, I sat in the sterile hotel room, my mind racing. The emotional shock had given way to a cold, calculating anger that I barely recognized in myself. I'd always been the reasonable one, the peacemaker, the woman who prided herself on emotional stability. Now I felt capable of a destruction that frightened me. But destruction wouldn't give me answers. Strategy would. The next morning, I returned home before Charles would leave for work. I showered, dressed, applied makeup with particular care, and prepared his favorite breakfast, cinnamon French toast with fresh berries. When he came downstairs, I greeted him with a kiss and a smile that never reached my eyes. What's the occasion? He asked, gesturing to the elaborate breakfast. Do I need an occasion to spoil my husband? I replied, pouring his coffee exactly how he liked it, 1 sugar, splash of cream. He looked momentarily disconcerted, perhaps sensing something off in my tone, but quickly recovered. Well, it looks delicious. Thank you. As he ate, I studied him with new awareness. The ease with which he accepted my performance, the perfect husband enjoying his wife's cooking, it was chilling. Because now I understood, Charles wasn't just lying to me. He was acting every minute we were together. Had been acting for years. How was the client presentation last night? I asked innocently. Charles launched into a detailed account of the fictional meeting, complete with names of people I knew were real colleagues, specific challenges they'd supposedly encountered, even a humorous anecdote about the client's eccentric demands. The performance was flawless, without a single tell or hesitation. I'd been married to a consummate actor for 20 years. After Charles left for work, I called Ryan again. I need more information about Rebecca Tanner, I told him. Her background, her relationship with Charles, everything. I can do that, Ryan replied, but may I ask why? You already have enough to confront Charles or file for divorce. Because I need to know if she's a victim too, I said, the realization clarifying as I spoke. I need to know if she believes she's his only wife, or if she's complicit in this deception. By Friday, Ryan had compiled a comprehensive profile on Rebecca Tanner. Elementary school teacher for 15 years, currently teaching 3rd grade at Oak Ridge Elementary. No previous marriages. Mother to Ethan, born 9 years ago. Active in the PTA, regular volunteer at the local animal shelter, generally well regarded in her community. As far as I can determine, Ryan concluded, she believes Charles Winston is a pharmaceutical sales representative whose job requires frequent travel. She has no apparent knowledge of you or his other life. Another victim, then. The knowledge provided no comfort, only a hollow sense of kinship with a woman who didn't know I existed. I spent the weekend in a state of hypervigilance, watching Charles's every move, analyzing every gesture, every word. He spent Saturday morning working in his home office, or so he claimed. I imagined him texting Rebecca, coordinating their stories, maintaining the elaborate fiction of his divided life. That evening, as we prepared for bed, Charles received a text that made him frown slightly. Everything okay? I asked, applying moisturizer at my vanity. Just work, he said, typing a quick response. A shipping issue with some samples. Nothing serious. Another lie, delivered with practiced ease. I nodded sympathetically, the perfect supportive wife, while inside, something hardened further. On Monday morning, I took a personal day from work and drove to Oak Ridge Elementary. Wearing large sunglasses and a scarf over my hair, a pathetic disguise, but better than nothing, I waited in my car until I spotted her entering the building, a tote bag slung over her shoulder, travel mug in hand. Rebecca Tanner. The woman who had unwittingly shared my husband for 9 years. I followed a sudden impulse and entered the school, finding the front office where a friendly secretary asked how she could help. I'm interested in enrolling my nephew, I improvised. I'd love to learn more about the 3rd grade program. I understand Ms. Tanner is an excellent teacher. 10 minutes later, I was being escorted to Rebecca's classroom, where she was preparing for the day, arranging books on small desks. She looked up with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes, tired eyes, I noticed, with faint shadows beneath them. Ms. Tanner? This is Mrs. Winters, who's considering our school for her nephew, the secretary introduced me. I saw no recognition in Rebecca's face at my name, further confirmation that she knew nothing of Charles's other life. "Nice to meet you," she said, extending her hand. "I'd be happy to tell you about our program." Her handshake was firm, her manner straightforward and warm. For 15 excruciating minutes, I sat in a child-sized chair while my husband's other partner passionately described her teaching philosophy, the curriculum, the special projects her students enjoyed. In another circumstance, I would have liked her immensely. As I was leaving, I noticed a photo on her desk, Rebecca with Ethan and Charles, the three of them beaming at the camera during what appeared to be a beach vacation. My stomach clenched at the sight of my husband's arm around her shoulders, his smile relaxed and genuine. "Your family?" I asked, gesturing to the photo. A shadow crossed her face. "My son and his father," she answered, her tone cooling slightly. "Thank you for your interest in our school, Mrs. Winters. The secretary can provide enrollment information." I left in a daze, unsettled by the brief glimpse into Charles's other life. In my car, I banged my hands against the steering wheel, frustration and rage finally breaking through my carefully maintained composure. "Damn you, Charles," I hissed, tears streaming down my face. "Damn you for doing this to both of us." That evening, I received a call from Ryan. "I've completed a deeper background investigation," he said without preamble. "I don't think you're going to like what I found." "Tell me," I demanded, stepping into the backyard where Charles wouldn't overhear. "Charles Winston doesn't just exist on paper," Ryan explained. "He has a complete digital footprint, social media accounts, credit history, employment records with a pharmaceutical company called Westfield Biologics." "But that's not real," I said, confusion clouding my thoughts. "Charles works for Parker Pharmaceuticals. He has for 15 years. That's just it, he works for both. Part-time at each." The HR department at Westfield confirmed he's been with them for 10 years, working a modified schedule that allows for consulting work elsewhere. His colleagues there know him exclusively as Charles Winston. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Not just separate relationships, but separate careers, separate identities, all carefully maintained by a man I had believed incapable of remembering our anniversary without a reminder. "There's more," Ryan continued reluctantly. "The birth certificate for Ethan? It lists his date of birth as May 17th. That's the day Charles was supposedly at a pharmaceutical conference in San Diego," I finished, the memory crystallizing with painful clarity. "He called me from the conference room, complained about the poor cell reception." I could hear people in the background. "He's created an elaborately compartmentalized life," Ryan said, professional admiration coloring his tone despite the circumstances. "I've never seen anything this comprehensive outside of actual government-sanctioned undercover operations." After ending the call, I stood in my garden, surrounded by the roses Charles and I had planted together 5 years ago, and made a decision. I wouldn't confront Charles yet. I wouldn't file for divorce or throw him out or set fire to his meticulously organized closet. No, I would do something far more devastating. I would dismantle his carefully constructed dual life piece by piece, bringing both of his worlds crashing down around him simultaneously. Because a man who could lie so completely, for so long, deserved nothing less than a reckoning of his own making. My plan began with a simple email to Rebecca Tanner from a newly created account, identifying myself only as someone with important information about Charles Winston. I suggested meeting at a cafe near her school the following afternoon. Her response came within hours. "Who is this? What information? Is Charles okay?" The concern seemed genuine. I replied simply, "Charles is fine. This concerns him and Ethan." Please come alone if you want the truth. She agreed to meet, her brief response tinged with wariness and maternal protectiveness. That night, as Charles and I ate dinner together, pasta primavera I'd prepared while fantasizing about lacing his portion with laxatives, I studied him with new awareness of his performance. I might need to go out of town next week, he mentioned casually. The Boston office is having issues with their inventory system. I nodded sympathetically, wondering which life this fabricated trip was actually intended to serve. How long will you be gone? Just 2 nights, he said, reaching for his wine. I'll try to wrap it up in one if possible. You do what you need to do, I replied, my tone soothing. Work is important. His smile, grateful, relieved, utterly false, made my skin crawl. You're the best, he said, squeezing my hand across the table. So understanding. I squeezed back, my answering smile never reaching my eyes. That's what wives are for, right? The cafe where I'd arranged to meet Rebecca was quiet when I arrived the next afternoon, most of the lunch crowd already gone. I selected a table in the back corner, ordered a black coffee, and waited, my heart pounding despite my outward calm. I recognized her immediately when she entered, the same woman I'd seen hugging Charles, the same dedicated teacher who'd enthusiastically described reading programs to me just days earlier. She looked nervous, scanning the cafe until I raised my hand slightly. As she approached, I could see confusion in her eyes. She had no idea who I was or why I'd asked her here. The innocence of her confusion only reinforced my belief that she was as much a victim as I was. You wanted to talk about Charles, she asked, remaining standing as if prepared to flee. Please, sit, I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. This isn't easy for either of us. She sat reluctantly, studying my face. Who are you? I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the seismic shift I was about to cause in both our lives. My name is Elaine Winters, I said, my voice calmer than I felt. I've been married to Charles Winters, the man you know as Charles Winston, for 20 years. The color drained from her face. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening. That's not possible. Charles is a widower. His wife died before we met. I almost laughed at that particular lie. I assure you, I'm very much alive. Charles and I live in Westfield, in the house we bought when our daughter was 10. We have 2 adult children, Melissa and Jason. Rebecca looked as if she might be sick. She shook her head repeatedly, denial warring with the certainty in my expression. This is insane, she whispered. We've been together for 10 years. We have a son. 9 years, I corrected gently. Ethan is 9. Born while Charles was supposedly at a pharmaceutical conference in San Diego. Her eyes widened at this specific detail. How do you know when Ethan was born? I've done my research, I said, opening a folder and sliding several documents across the table, copies of Charles's dual driver's licenses, property records for her house showing both their names, photos Ryan had taken of Charles entering and leaving both homes. Oh my God, she breathed, staring at the evidence of her shattered reality. Oh my God. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I waited, allowing her the space to process the devastating revelation. Finally, she looked up, wiping her eyes. 10 years, she said, her voice steadier. 10 years of my life with a man who doesn't actually exist. 9 for you, 20 for me, I replied, a strange sense of solidarity forming between us. Charles has been living a complete double life, 2 homes, 2 jobs, 2 families. Neither of us knew about the other. How did you find out? She asked, her initial shock giving way to the same anger I had felt upon discovering the truth. Credit card statements, I explained. Hotel charges for the nights he wasn't with either of us. I hired a private investigator who uncovered the rest. Rebecca nodded slowly, something hardening in her expression. I noticed changes recently. He's been more distracted, checking his phone constantly. I actually thought he might be having an affair. A bitter laugh escaped her. I guess he was, with his wife. The irony wasn't lost on me. I might have smiled if the situation weren't so utterly tragic. What happens now? Rebecca asked, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered the documents I'd provided. It was the question I'd been asking myself for days. What did happen when your entire life was revealed as an elaborate fiction? When the man you'd loved and trusted proved capable of breathtaking deception? That depends partly on you, I said carefully. Charles doesn't know that I know about you and Ethan. He doesn't know that we've met. She nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. You want us to confront him together. I think it's the only way to ensure he can't manipulate either of us, I explained. If I confront him alone, he could deny everything, make me sound paranoid. If you confront him alone, he could spin a story about me being unstable or vindictive. Together, he can't deny anything, she finished, a spark of determination replacing the devastation in her eyes. A strange sense of fellowship formed between us in that moment, two women deceived by the same man, now united in their determination to expose his lies. We spent the next hour planning our approach, sharing details of our respective lives with Charles, finding both unsettling similarities and stark differences in how he presented himself to each of us. He told me his company requires frequent travel to maintain client relationships, Rebecca said. I assume those are the times he's with you. And he told me his consulting work requires late nights and occasional business trips, I replied. Those must be his times with you. The meticulous compartmentalization required to maintain two separate families for nearly a decade was both impressive and disturbing. Charles had created elaborate systems of deception, managing to give enough time and attention to both households that neither Rebecca nor I had suspected we were sharing the same man. Friday, Rebecca said finally. Ethan is staying at a friend's house for a sleepover. Charles is supposed to come over for dinner. We can confront him then. I nodded, the plan crystallizing. I'll tell him I'm having dinner with college friends. He won't suspect anything. As we prepared to leave, Rebecca paused. I never wanted this, she said quietly. I never wanted to be the other woman. I thought we had something real, something honest. I believe you, I replied, and I did. Her shock and distress had been too genuine to fake. Charles is the only villain in this story. The next 2 days were the hardest, maintaining the facade of normalcy with Charles while preparing for the moment when his carefully constructed world would collapse. I found myself vacillating between cold fury and profound grief for the marriage I had thought was solid, for the decades of shared history that now seemed tainted by his deception. Friday evening arrived with an air of grim inevitability. I kissed Charles goodbye, telling him to enjoy his evening while I attended my fictional dinner with friends. He looked relaxed, unsuspecting, as he wished me a pleasant night. I drove to Rebecca's house, their house, I reminded myself, arriving just before the time Charles was expected. My heart pounded so violently I could feel it in my temples as she let me in. Are you ready for this? I asked, noting her pale face and resolute expression. She nodded, squaring her shoulders. As ready as I'll ever be. We positioned ourselves in the living room, Rebecca on the sofa, me in an armchair partially hidden from the entryway. We would let Charles enter, let him greet Rebecca normally, before I made my presence known. At precisely 7 p.m., a key turned in the lock. I held my breath as the door opened, revealing Charles carrying a bottle of wine and what appeared to be a small gift bag. "Hello, beautiful," he called out, his voice so different, more relaxed, slightly deeper, that I almost didn't recognize it. "I brought that Pinot you loved from." He stopped abruptly as he rounded the corner and saw Rebecca's expression. "What's wrong? Is it Ethan?" "No," she said quietly. "Ethan is fine. But we need to talk, Charles. Or would you prefer I call you Charlie? I hear that's what your wife calls you." Confusion crossed his face, quickly replaced by alarm as his eyes darted around, finally landing on me as I stood up, moving into his line of sight. "Hello, Charlie," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "Surprise." The blood drained from his face. The wine bottle slipped from his grasp, thudding onto the carpet. For several seconds, he seemed incapable of speech, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Elaine," he finally managed, his voice a strangled whisper. How? How did I discover you've been living a complete double life for the past decade?" I finished for him. "It wasn't that difficult once I started looking. You got sloppy with the hotel receipts." Rebecca stood, moving to stand beside me in a show of solidarity that must have terrified him. "You told me you were a widower," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You said your wife had died of cancer before we met. But here she stands, very much alive." Charles staggered backward, collapsing onto the sofa as if his legs could no longer support him. In that moment, he looked older than his 55 years, the weight of his deception physically crushing him. "I never meant, this wasn't supposed to," he stammered, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I'd once found endearing. "What wasn't supposed to happen, Charles?" I demanded, advancing on him. "You weren't supposed to get caught? We weren't supposed to find out about each other? Which part of your elaborate deception was the accident?" He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "All of it," he whispered. "And none of it. I never planned to create this. It just happened, one small lie at a time, until I was trapped in a life I couldn't escape." "You expect us to believe that?" Rebecca's voice was incredulous. "That you accidentally maintained two separate identities, two separate families, for nearly a decade?" Charles shook his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. No, I don't expect you to believe anything I say now. But I need, to try to explain." For the next hour, we sat in Rebecca's living room as Charles revealed the genesis and evolution of his double life. It had begun, he claimed, when he met Rebecca at a pharmaceutical conference in Boston, a real conference, ironically, one of the few honest details in his story. "You were fascinating," he told Rebecca, not meeting her eyes. "Passionate about teaching, full of life in a way that reminded me of who I used to be. Before career advancement and mortgages and college tuition payments took over my life." He described feeling trapped in what he called a comfortable but joyless existence, a characterization of our marriage that felt like a slap across my face. "I didn't plan to see Rebecca again," he continued, glancing between us. "But I couldn't stop thinking about her. About the possibility of a different kind of life." What had started as a long-distance affair evolved when Rebecca announced her pregnancy. Instead of confessing to either of us, Charles had created an elaborate fiction, establishing a separate identity as Charles Winston, setting up a part-time arrangement with a second pharmaceutical company, and ultimately building a complete alternate life. At first, I told myself it was temporary, he said, his voice hollow. That I would find a way to resolve the situation, to minimize the hurt. But as Ethan grew, as our life together developed, he glanced at Rebecca. The idea of losing either of my families became unthinkable. So you just decided to live two separate lives indefinitely? I asked, disbelief coloring my tone. To lie to both of us every day, for years? Charles nodded, his expression haunted. I know how insane it sounds. But it became almost normal. I had systems, routines. Different phones, different clothes, different mannerisms for each life. After a while, I could switch between Charles Winters and Charles Winston without even thinking about it. You're describing the behavior of a sociopath, Rebecca said, her voice cold. Do you even understand what you've done to us? To Ethan? At the mention of his son, Charles's composure finally broke. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders heaving with silent sobs. I love my son, he said when he could speak again. I love all my children. And I loved both of you, in different ways. I know that sounds impossible, even monstrous, but it's the truth. Love doesn't lie, I said quietly. Not like this. Not so completely. What you're describing isn't love, Charles. It's possession. Control. He looked up, a flash of anger momentarily replacing his remorse. It wasn't like that. I never tried to control either of you. I gave you both good lives, didn't I? Provided for you, supported your careers, shared child-rearing responsibilities. I was a good husband, a good father. A good husband doesn't live a double life. I exploded, the calm I'd maintained finally shattering. A good father doesn't secretly maintain two separate families. You didn't give us good lives, you gave us lives built on fundamental lies. Rebecca placed a restraining hand on my arm, her touch surprisingly comforting. He's not worth your anger, Elaine, she said gently. He's not worth any more of our emotion. She turned to Charles, her voice hardening. I want you out of this house within the hour. You can arrange to see Ethan through my attorney, but our relationship is over. I won't have a liar raising my son. Our son, Charles corrected automatically, then flinched at Rebecca's withering glare. The son you've been lying to since the day he was born, she amended. The son who believes his father is a man named Charles Winston, a man who doesn't actually exist. Charles turned to me, desperation in his eyes. Elaine, please. 20 years. We can't just throw that away. We? I laughed bitterly. There is no we anymore, Charles. You destroyed that the moment you decided to create your little side family. It wasn't like that, he protested weakly. Then what was it like? I demanded. Explain to me how living a complete life for a decade was some kind of noble act. He slumped further, whatever defense he had prepared crumbling under the weight of our combined fury and disappointment. I don't expect forgiveness, he said after a long moment of silence. I don't deserve it. But I want you both to know that despite the deception, my feelings for you, for all of you, our children included, were genuine. How comforting, I replied, my voice dripping with sarcasm. We'll be sure to remember that while we're picking up the pieces of our shattered lives. As the confrontation wound down, a strange calm settled over the room. The initial shock and fury had given way to a profound sadness, not just for the relationships destroyed, but for the man sitting before us, who had created a life so compartmentalized and precarious that its collapse was always just one mistake away. I'll stay with my brother tonight, Charles said finally, standing up. I'll give you both space to decide what you want to do next. I've already decided, I said, my voice steady. I've consulted a divorce attorney. You'll be hearing from her next week. Rebecca nodded in agreement. And you won't be coming back here, Charles. Not ever. I'll arrange for you to see Ethan, but our relationship is over. He accepted these pronouncements without argument, looking suddenly older, deflated, as if the energy required to maintain his elaborate deception had been the only thing keeping him upright. At the door, he turned back one last time. For what it's worth, and I know it's worth very little now, I am truly sorry for the pain I've caused you both. Neither of us responded as he walked out, closing the door quietly behind him. Left alone, Rebecca and I looked at each other, two women connected by betrayal, by shared pain, by the sudden dismantling of lives we had believed were real. What will you do now? She asked softly. Rebuild, I said after a moment's thought. On my own terms this time. What about you? The same, I suppose. Ethan will need support through this. He adores Charles. I thought of the boy I had never met, who shared my husband's smile and who would now have to learn that his father had been living a lie for his entire life. If you need anything. I began, then stopped, unsure what I could offer this woman who had unknowingly shared my husband for nearly a decade. Thank you, she said, understanding the unfinished sentiment. Actually, I'd like to keep in touch, if that's not too strange. No one else can really understand what this is like. I nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. As different as our situations were, we were bound by this shared experience, by the man who had loved us both, betrayed us both, and ultimately lost us both through his own deception. 6 months later, I sat in my attorney's office, signing the final divorce papers. Charles had not contested anything, accepting the division of assets I had proposed without argument. In the months since his double life had been exposed, he had retreated into relative obscurity, taking a position with a pharmaceutical company in Arizona, about as far from either of his former families as he could get while remaining in the continental United States. Well, that's it, Eleanor, my attorney said as I signed the last page. You are officially divorced. I set down the pen, a complex mix of emotions washing over me. Relief. Sadness. And something unexpected, a sense of liberation. How does it feel? Eleanor asked, studying my face. Like closing a book I thought I knew the ending to, only to discover the author had written a completely different story when I wasn't looking, I replied. She laughed softly. That's a new one. Most clients just say relieved or devastated. I'm both, I suppose, I admitted. And neither. Mostly, I feel awake. Like I've been sleepwalking through a marriage that wasn't what I thought it was, and now I'm finally seeing clearly. As I left Eleanor's office, my phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Signed the papers today. It's officially over. Dinner next week? Over the past months, Rebecca and I had developed an unusual friendship, meeting regularly to process our shared trauma and to support each other through the legal and emotional aftermath of Charles's deception. What had begun as a traumatic connection had evolved into something I valued deeply, a relationship based on complete honesty and mutual respect. Just finished signing mine too, I texted back. Dinner sounds perfect. My place this time? Her reply came quickly, I'll bring wine. Ethan's doing better, by the way. The therapist says he's adjusting well. I smiled, relieved. Telling Ethan the truth had been one of the hardest parts of this whole ordeal, explaining to a 9-year-old boy that his father had been living under a false name, that he had another family, another life. Rebecca had handled it with remarkable grace, focusing on reassuring Ethan that he was loved, that none of this was his fault. My own children had been stunned by the revelations about their father, their reactions ranging from Melissa's cold fury to Jason's confused hurt. They had both eventually reached a fragile reconciliation with Charles, agreeing to maintain contact while making it clear they needed time to process his betrayal. As I drove home, to the condo I had purchased after selling the house that held too many memories, I reflected on the strange journey of the past year. The discovery of Charles's deception had shattered the life I thought I knew, forcing me to rebuild from the ground up. But in that rebuilding, I had discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I had forged new connections, not just with Rebecca, but with myself. The woman who had been content to play second fiddle in her own marriage had found her voice, her power, her sense of self-worth. Charles had stolen years from me through his deception. But the future was still mine to shape, on my own terms, with the truth as my foundation. And that, I realized as I unlocked the door to my new home, was a gift I never expected to receive from the man who had betrayed me so completely. The truth had set me free,